All right, so get ready because today we are diving into some seriously thought-provoking stuff. You sent over this text about how semantics and philosophy are all intertwined, and wow, it's really got me thinking about how we use language like every single day.
It really makes you step back and think, doesn't it?
It does. It even questions like, can we ever really truly understand each other?
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you think about how much what we mean depends on the context of everything.
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, really. I mean, we take communication for granted so often, but then you start, peeling back those layers of meaning and things get really interesting really fast.
Yeah, and our text here jumps right into a total mind bender. It starts talking about the morning star and the evening star, and we all know it's the same planet, right? Venus.
Right.
But the way we think about it, the way we even talk about it, changes depending on if we see it in the morning or the evening.
Exactly, and that's a classic example from the philosopher Gottlob Frege. What he was getting at is how a single thing, in this case, the planet Venus, can have different senses, even though it has the same reference.
Okay, so the reference is like the actual thing in the world, but the sense is how we're understanding it, like in our minds.
Exactly.
So this is making me think about like how politicians, for instance, can use the same word, like let's say freedom, but mean completely different things.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's sense at work, right?
Yeah.
Changing how we understand the message.
Absolutely. And this whole idea of sense versus reference has huge implications for how we think about language in general.
Okay, I'm listening.
It raises questions like, does language simply mirror the world as it is? Or does it actually shape, how we perceive reality? These are some of the big questions that are driving what we call the philosophy of language.
Okay, so we're already getting into some pretty deep philosophical water here. But our text just keeps going, and it talks about how even like simple phrases can totally change meaning depending on when and how they're said.
Oh, for sure. Like take something as basic as, I'll do that tomorrow.
I mean, yeah, that seems pretty straightforward. What's so complicated about that?
Well, think about the context. If it's, say, Monday morning, and you say, I'll do that tomorrow, tomorrow clearly means Tuesday, right?
Right.
But what if it's, late on a Friday night and you're saying, I'll do that tomorrow? Well, that tomorrow might stretch out a little bit longer.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
Suddenly this simple phrase is loaded with, possibilities and maybe even a little bit of procrastination too.
Definitely some procrastination.
Wow.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
But how does this, relate back to philosophy specifically?
Well, when you connect it to the bigger picture, it really highlights how slippery meaning can actually be. Because, philosophers, they rely on this shared understanding of terms to be able to build their arguments. But if those terms are constantly shifting and changing,
Oh, I see, yeah.
then their whole argument could kind of fall apart.
It's like building a house on sand, right?
Yeah, exactly.
If the foundation's not solid, the whole thing's going to crumble.
Exactly.
So basically, context is king when it comes to meaning.
Mm.
But then how do we, even begin to pin down what meaning is in a world where words can be so fluid?
Well, that's where things get extra interesting because philosophers have come up with different theories to try and tackle this problem.
Okay.
One major theory that is mentioned in the text here is something called truth-conditional semantics. This argues that the meaning of a sentence is tied to what would make it true in the actual world.
So, is that saying that a sentence only makes sense if it can be, proven true?
In a way, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's about the conditions that have to be met for it to be true.
So, the example in the text, the cat is on the mat.
Exactly.
So, for that to be meaningful, there's got to be a real cat, a real mat, and that cat's got to be sitting on that mat.
You got it. It's all about how language hooks onto those states of affairs in the world.
Okay.
And if those conditions aren't met, then the statement kind of loses its truth and, according to this theory, its meaning as well. But then there's another big theory in the game, the reference theory.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting. Tell me more.
Okay, so this one, championed by folks like Bertrand Russell, says that the meaning of a statement comes from what it actually refers to, the actual things involved.
Right.
Think about the phrase, the President of the United States.
Right.
It gains its meaning from whoever holds that office at that particular time.
Right, okay.
But, and here's where things get a little bit tricky, our text brought up this really interesting puzzle.
Okay.
What about the sentence, the current king of France is bald?
Wait a minute, France doesn't have a king. So how can that sentence even mean anything if it's referring to something that doesn't exist? That's like a paradox, right?
You're exactly right. You've hit on a major point of contention in the philosophy of language. It's known as the problem of empty terms.
Empty terms, okay.
Yeah, how can language refer to things that don't exist? And what does that mean for the very concept of meaning itself? It's a great example of how semantics grapples with these tricky edge cases of language.
So like even a simple sentence can send philosophers into a tailspin, huh?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But it does make you think, what about when we talk about things that aren't even like physical objects, like justice or freedom?
Yeah, that's a great question.
How does semantics help us make sense of those kinds of abstract concepts?
Well, that's where semantics becomes absolutely essential for navigating that world of abstract thought. If justice isn't something that you can just point to, how do we even begin to have a conversation about it? How do we even know if we're all on the same page when we use that word?
Yeah, it's like trying to, I don't know, grasp smoke.
Exactly.
You can't really get a hold of it, but it's definitely there. And our text mentioned some pretty big names too, like John Locke and David Hume. They were like wrestling with how language shapes our understanding of these abstract ideas, and even like our own identities.
Yeah, they were grappling with some pretty big questions, like how much does the name we're given influence who we become? You know, if we change our name, does that change our identity? It's all tied to this idea of how meaning is constructed and how it's shared through language.
Wow, so this is some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And just when I thought we were maybe getting a handle on things, our text throws in another curveball, the ship of Theseus.
Oh,
I vaguely remember this from like a philosophy class ages ago.
yeah.
But remind me, what's the deal with this ship?
Oh, it's a classic thought experiment. It's all about identity, but identity over time. So imagine this ship, the ship of Theseus, right? And over time, every single plank of wood, every sail, every rope gets replaced. Is it still the same ship? If not, at what point did it stop being the original?
Whoa.
Yeah.
So like if every part of it is different, does the word ship even still apply? Does the name Ship of Theseus even still hold meaning? This is like, I mean, this is blowing my mind, but I can see how this thought experiment forces us to really think about how we define identity.
Exact.
Not just for objects, but maybe for ourselves too.
Exactly. And that's where semantics helps us to break down and analyze how words like identity, continuity, change, all of those, how they operate in these different philosophical contexts.
This deep dive is already so thought-provoking. We've gone from like the literal meaning of words to like how language shapes our understanding of reality. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
Well, where we've been focusing so far is mostly on semantics, right?
Right.
The dictionary definition of words and sentences. But to really understand how we communicate, we've got to bring in another really crucial element, pragmatics.
Pragmatics. Okay,
Yeah.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
What's the difference, though, between pragmatics and semantics? Because it seems like they both deal with meaning, right?
You're absolutely right. They do both deal with meaning. But think of it this way. Semantics is like if you were looking up a word in the dictionary, right? Just kind of isolated, no context.
Right.
It gives you that kind of basic definition.
Right.
But pragmatics talks into account how that word's meaning can change based on who's saying it, when they're saying it, why they're saying it. It's about, the unspoken rules and the intentions behind the language.
So semantics is like the dictionary definition.
Yeah.
And pragmatics is like reading between the lines.
Exactly.
I like it. And I bet our text has a great example to illustrate this.
It does. Think about that classic line, can you pass the salt?
Right.
Now, on a purely semantic level, that's just a simple question about your ability to, move a condiment.
Right.
But in reality, we all know it's a polite request.
Right. You're not going to just say, yes, I am physically capable of passing the salt, and then sit there.
Exactly.
Like we instinctively understand there's like a hidden meaning there, a request kind of like under the surface of the question. So that's pragmatics in action.
Pragmatics at work.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But like, isn't that just, politeness? Doesn't the literal meaning still kind of matter?
Well, that's a great point, and it illustrates how both semantics and pragmatics are essential for, successful communication.
Okay.
So while politeness might influence our response, the literal meaning still forms kind of the foundation of the interaction. So they work together.
You work together. Okay.
Yeah.
So how does this all play into the philosophy of language, though?
Well, philosophers aren't just, analyzing the literal truth of statements. They're also looking at the intentions behind them, the actions that those statements perform, and the impact they have on the listener.
It's like how a single word like, let's say promise, can carry so much weight.
Yeah.
Like saying, I promise. You're not just stating a fact. You're like committing to an action. You're creating an obligation. That's some serious linguistic power.
It absolutely is. And that brings us to what's known as speech act theory, which our source touched on a bit.
Okay.
This is something that philosophers like J.L. Austin and John Searle really explored.
Okay.
The idea that words don't just convey information, they can actually do things in the world.
Wait, so like words can be verbs as well as nouns.
Exactly.
I'm loving this. Tell me more about like how this speech act theory works.
Okay, so think about it this way. When a judge says guilty in a courtroom,
Right.
they're not just, describing a state of being.
Right.
That word carries what we call a performative force. It actually changes the reality of the situation for the defendant.
Oh, wow.
Same with like vows in a wedding ceremony.
Right.
The words that are spoken actually transform the relationship between two people.
That is incredible. It makes you realize like how much power is packed into our everyday language. Like we're not just talking, we're actually shaping reality with what we say.
Okay.
But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's circle back to some of the philosophers who have like shaped how we understand language.
Yeah.
Our source mentions a few key figures like Wittgenstein. What was his big idea?
Wittgenstein, yes. He's a giant in the philosophy of language.
Okay.
And he's very famous for this idea of language games.
Language games.
Look, his argument was that there's no single fixed meaning for any word.
Okay.
Instead, the meaning depends on the game that we're playing with language at that particular moment.
Okay, game on. Explain this whole language game concept a little more for me. I'm intrigued, but I need like a real world example.
All right, so imagine the word red.
Okay.
In a scientific context, red might refer to a specific wavelength of light, right? But in a game of red light, green light, it takes on a totally different meaning. It signals, when to stop and go.
Right.
And then even in a more abstract sense, red could symbolize, danger or passion, depending on the context.
So the word stays the same, but the rules of the game change how we interpret it.
Exactly. Meaning isn't fixed, it's fluid, it depends on the situation.
Okay, so Wittgenstein is basically saying that like to understand meaning, you have to understand the context.
Yeah.
The rules, the purpose of the communication.
You got it.
That is really insightful. It makes you think about how like miscommunication can happen so easily when people are playing different language games, right?
Exactly. We might be using the same words, but if we're operating under different rules or different assumptions,
Right, yeah.
our meanings can totally clash.
Right, this is making me see like even everyday conversations in a whole new light. We've gone from like the dictionary definition of words to how words can actually shape reality. And now with Wittgenstein, how meaning is like constantly negotiated through these like language games that we're playing. But it leaves me with a big question. If meaning is so fluid, so context dependent, can two people ever truly like perfectly understand each other? I mean, we all bring our own like baggage, our own interpretations to every interaction, right?
That is a profound question, and honestly, there is no easy answer.
Yeah.
I mean, some might argue that perfect understanding is simply an illusion.
Yeah.
That we're always filtering communication through, our own unique experiences and our own biases. But others might say that true understanding is more about striving for connection,
Okay.
for building these bridges of shared meaning, even when our perspectives are different.
It's like we're trying to map each other's like internal worlds, which are constantly changing and evolving.
Exactly.
But maybe that's the beauty of language, the ongoing process of trying to connect, to bridge those gaps in understanding.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Communication isn't about achieving perfect alignment. It's about engaging in this kind of continuous dance of meaning making, trying to see the world through each other's eyes, even if just for a moment.
This deep dive has been amazing. We've covered so much ground. From the literal meaning of words to the ways language shapes our reality and how context and intention play such a crucial role in communication. So we've made it, huh? We've journeyed through the philosophy of language. We've explored how context shapes meaning. And we even dipped our toes into the mind-bending world of speech acts. But before we wrap up this whole deep dive, I have to ask, what does it all mean for us? How can we actually use these insights from semantics and philosophy in our everyday lives?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The key takeaway, I think, is awareness. Even understanding just a little bit about semantics, about pragmatics, makes us more conscious of like how language works, both its power and its limitations.
So it's like instead of just like throwing words around, we start thinking about the intentions behind them, the impact they have, and like all the potential for misunderstanding. It's like becoming a language ninja.
Exactly. We start to see those subtle ways that context and tone of voice, even like body language, can influence what we mean. And we become better listeners, more attuned to what's being said and even what's not being said. Ultimately, I think this all leads to communication that's more effective, more empathetic, and just like more meaningful overall.
So we're leveling up our communication skills by understanding the hidden rules of the game. But there's one question that's been kind of nagging at me this whole time.
Okay.
We talked about how context is king, how meaning can be fluid, and how our interpretations can be so different. So given all of that, is it even possible for two people to ever truly understand each other, like perfectly?
Wow, that is a really deep question. And honestly, there's no simple answer. Some people might argue that perfect understanding is just an illusion, that we're always filtering everything through our own experiences, our own biases. But others might say that no, true understanding is about constantly striving for that connection, building these bridges of shared meaning, even when we see things differently.
It's almost like we're like trying to map each other's internal worlds, which are always changing, always evolving. But maybe that's the beauty of language, this ongoing process of trying to connect and bridge those gaps in understanding.
I think you've got it. Communication isn't about like reaching perfect alignment. It's about this continuous dance of meaning making, trying to see the world through someone else's eyes, even if it's just for a brief moment.
This deep dive has been a wild ride. I know I'm going to be thinking about conversations differently from now on. And to our listener, we'll leave you with this final thought. Now that you're a bit more aware of just how complex meaning is, how powerful context can be, and, all the potential for misinterpretations, how will you approach your next conversation? Will you listen more closely, speak a bit more mindfully, and really strive for that deeper connection, even if perfect understanding remains elusive?
It's a journey worth taking.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of semantics and philosophy. We'll see you next time for another deep